Hello, my name is Mark Pengelly. I've been a minister in the Methodist Church for over 20 years now, and contrary to the usual stereotypes, my ministry has never been dull. Unlike the vicars in many TV dramas, I don't spend most of my time hanging around in the church, endlessly putting out hymn books and collecting them up again. My work is often varied, sometimes challenging, and when engaging with people at the most momentous times in their lives, it's a deep honour. Ministry has never been predictable, but perhaps one of the things I hadn't anticipated was that the convictions of my Christian faith would bring me into conflict with the civil authorities. But in September 2020, I was arrested for obstruction of the highway whilst riding my bicycle in London. I'd been inspired by Rowan Williams, former Archbishop, who'd encouraged Christians to join the Extinction Rebellion Month of Action. This is what he said then.
People of faith should be here because they're people of faith. That is, because they believe that they can make a difference of some kind and that difference is worth making. At the moment, we're at a remarkable moment of opportunity, you might say. People are talking about building back better. We have to take the opportunity, not of recovering what's been lost, but of building again something that is genuinely more sustainable. Because in the last few months, we have seen the possibility of some alternatives that might work. And I think people of faith ought to be on board with making those alternatives work, taking that moment of opportunity.
So, challenged by this, I took my bicycle into London to join a large group of cyclists in an event called Critical Mass. These large gatherings of cyclists are a call to action to councils, governments, road planners to properly and thoughtfully design in the safety of all road users, including those who prefer to walk and cycle, instead of prioritising motor traffic above all else. Critical Mass cyclists cause non-violent disruption because of their sheer numbers, and this is what got me into trouble. Of course, the traffic jams caused by cars every day are no such problem. As I spent time in the cells, and ever since I've been considering the rights and wrongs of civil disobedience and the extent to which, because of my Christian convictions, I should be involved in protest which resorts to non-violent direct action. Simply put, is it right to protest if it brings us into conflict with the authorities? Protesters down the centuries are convinced of the answer to this, but I'm aware that many of the people in my churches, as well as many others, would question if this is an appropriate course of action, especially to those who claim the name Christian. I've had the opportunity to further explore this question through the generous gift of the Methodist Church to its ministers, a 3-month sabbatical. My many thanks. That's given me time to speak to others who've been involved in various types of protest. But before we turn to them, let's turn to the person who got me into this position in the first place. That's the person of Jesus. Lawbreaker is probably not the first thing that comes to mind when you think of Jesus, but for me, it's impossible to read the gospel accounts of the life of Jesus and not conclude that he had a lifetime of conflict with those in both political and religious authority, although, as is seen through history, these two power bases are often conflated. From his birth, Jesus is portrayed as a threat to Herod's rule. In his teaching, with his declaration of a new kind of kingdom, time and again we see Jesus rebelling against the conventions of both religion and broader society. In the cleansing of the temple, where Jesus overturns the tables of the money changers and drives out traders, we see Jesus willing to go beyond words and take direct action. Of course, his challenge to the religious authorities resulted ultimately in his execution. I wanted to ask others who'd been involved in direct action because of Christian convictions about their experiences and ask them what led them to do more than send emails and postcards to MPs. Dan Woodhouse has supported the campaign against the arms trade for many years, and his direct action put him almost literally in the firing line as he sought to highlight injustice.
My name's Dan Woodhouse. I'm a Methodist minister, presbyter, currently serving in the Brighton and Hove district, previously in Leeds.
And you've been involved in various kinds of protest and action yourself.
I've been part of the campaign against the arms trade for a long time. There was weapons sales to Saudi Arabia, and Saudi Arabia were pretty clearly committing war crimes on a very regular basis with planes and weapons. Weapons bought from the UK, planes maintained and bought from the UK. And when we realised that there was no other kind of way to change this, legal bodies were being ignored, even though they were kind of saying that this was illegal. It came down to the point where the only thing left to do was to physically try and stop these planes. So Sam Walton, a Quaker friend of mine, and myself planned and then attempted to break into a base, which we did. This was a kind of a private military arms base in order to physically disarm the plane safely for us and other people. And so they couldn't take off. They couldn't go to Saudi, and then they couldn't bomb and be involved in war crimes in Yemen. So that's what we did, yeah.
And you were literally taking some pretty serious risk, because I presume an airbase like this would have armed guards, and in fact you were caught.
Yeah, that's right. We didn't know about armed guards. We think probably less likely, because I say it's private rather than military. But they could have been dogs. Yeah, in the end, it was actually, the security was fairly tame, fairly nice actually to us, and a little bit confused. But yeah, we were.
I'm particularly interested to know what you were thinking and had thought in preparation about where to draw the line in terms of protest and action.
You know, these things are very rarely, if ever, an out of the blue thing. And I know activists often get referred to as rent-a-mob. People just want to turn up to cause trouble, and that's because mostly that's what all they see. They only see the direct action, or the thing that makes the headline. So people just assume, oh, this must be all they do. But actually, you know, these campaigns, which have been running for months or years, or even in this case decades, to try and bring about an end, as I say, to the worst excesses at least of the arms trade, and particularly this continuing war in Yemen. And so I'm part of a big movement of people who are trying to bring about an end to this kind of stuff, and we've done lots of actions in the past. You know, we've talked to MPs, we've protested in more conventional ways, I suppose, we've written letters. You know, we've done everything we could think of to try and stop this in more conventional means.
The first time I was involved in protest was also against war, when with my family I joined 1 million, or maybe 2 million, depends who you want to believe, on the streets of London to protest against the impending 2003 Iraq War. The church I was nurtured in since childhood didn't teach me that I should consider radical protest and civil disobedience to be part of the cost of discipleship. But over a number of years, I've been so troubled about injustice and the oppression of those least able to have a voice that I decided I must find a way to speak out, do something more than write to my MP or sign a petition. And most people who protest have done those things as well. Here's the perspective of another minister colleague of mine who was also arrested.
I'm Jo Rand. I am a presbyter in the South Lakes Circuit in Cumbria, based in Grange-over-Sands. I went on an Extinction Rebellion action in October 2019, and I was arrested as I tried to, as part of the group, we tried to take control of Lambeth Bridge. I climbed over the barrier and tried to sit on the road, and I was carried off by 4 police officers.
And it's interesting, it's Lambeth Bridge where I got into trouble, Joe. It's all happening on Lambeth Bridge.
Oh, absolutely.
Tell me about what led up to you thinking that you wanted to take a step like that, because some will think it's quite extreme.
Yeah, and I can understand that. And actually, when the day began, I really didn't intend. I didn't go with the intention of being arrested at 9:15 in the morning, which was how it happened. I had been really inspired over months before, hearing about some of the people who were involved with XR and had been arrested. Some of the Christians, so Christian Climate Action is the sort of Christian group within Extinction Rebellion, and but hearing about the ethos of Extinction Rebellion, hearing about some of the Christians who were involved, and I suppose perhaps for quite a long time I'd felt that if there was a if there was a cause that really needed people to stand up and risk arrest, I'd be prepared. And this just really grew in my mind that this was the cause. I felt a real calling from God. So I'd gone that day to London, intending to be there for the full for a week or so of the protest, thinking, well, I hadn't had time to be involved in things beforehand, hadn't made much contact with people, hadn't been on the training that XR offer. So I thought, well, I'll get, and people had said, well, there'll be training available when you get there. So I thought, well, I'll see how it goes. I'll see if I can do some of this training, and then perhaps at some point during the week, if it seems right, I'll be prepared to take action that might put me in in that place. So the aim was for different faith groups working together to try and take control of Lambeth Bridge and to set it up as a space, a multi-faith space for prayer, which that also just really inspired me and spoke to me. That actually all faiths acting together. There were quite a lot of police there. They were obviously trying to prevent us doing that. And I suppose I just felt, actually, somebody's got to take that step.
I've asked myself if I really need to take that step, but I cannot help but feel sometimes we simply cannot sit back. During the course of my sabbatical, I heard that Christian Climate Action, that's the Christians involved in Extinction Rebellion, were planning to protest outside the Methodist Westminster Central Hall in London, who, as part of their work hosting conferences, were holding the Shell annual general meeting. A number of people, including other Methodists and my wife, Sheridan, and I, gathered for a 24-hour prayer vigil and to object to Methodism hosting this event. This was deemed controversial because of recent decisions that the Methodist Church made at its conference. And I spoke to Methodist minister Mark Harwood.
Well, I'm from the Sankey Valley Circuit, which is in the Liverpool district, and although I'm trying to be very geared in on climate activism, certainly in our local churches they're looking at becoming eco-congregations, and we've had a whole series of services in the run up to COP26.
Mark explained what had brought him to protest outside a church of his own denomination.
Yeah, so at last year's conference, after lots of campaigning and sort of negotiations and so on, the Methodist Church, the Methodist Conference, which is the sort of governing body of the Methodist Church, voted to instruct all its investments to be divested from fossil fuels, including Shell. So that was great. And to be fair, some of the materials that are produced by the Methodist Church and others are excellent. Materials to encourage people to think, to discuss, to act, to campaign. In fact, they have a thing called the Joint Public Issues Team, and they produce some great materials. In fact, just this very week in May, I got something saying campaign against some of the banks and their funding of fossil fuels, which I thought was fabulous. And then my son, who's a bit of an XR connected, tells me 10 days ago that Shell AGM's being held at Methodist Central Hall. And I said, no. They wouldn't do that, no. It'll be at some large hall in Westminster area somewhere. So anyway, of course, he shows me the details. And lo and behold, I was shocked to find this out. And everybody I've spoken to in our local churches is just bewildered at how that is possible.
I asked Melanie Nazareth from Christian Climate Action London to explain what inspired her to get involved in direct action.
What inspired me, and that I think the absolute bottom line is that it's a faith response. I can do nothing else. And I say that not only intellectually, but from the heart, because I hadn't ever considered that this would be a way of responding. But I happened to walk into a protest, and God put this in my heart, and I knew that this was what I had to do. It was just as clear as day, and that was just astonishing to me to find. I'm 61 now, and for that to happen at sort of the latter part of my life, when I was thinking of being a quiet couch potato, was really exciting.
I think it's that word activism that scares many ordinary people off, but it's hard not to read the Gospels and see the Lord whom we seek to follow as the activist that inspires us.
So activist just means someone who does something. I mean, it does sound like a scary word because it's got all these awful political connotations, but it's not. It's someone who stands up and does something and stands up and be counted. And I just don't think we can be bystanders anymore to this. And I think even in the Old Testament, there's this whole need to exercise your prophetic voice when things have gone wrong.
I found the language of not being a bystander particularly challenging, and spoke to others who had also decided they couldn't be bystanders.
We know there's a strong element of justice and challenging injustice, and also there are a lot of prophetic symbolic acts within the Bible.
Yeah, it is a global justice issue, which has been highlighted by Tear Fund, by Christian Aid, and we can't ignore it. And it should encourage us and inspire us to. That it's something for everybody. That justice isn't a climate issue. This is a church issue. This is a justice issue. It's everything. Yeah. So.
The challenge to myself with regard to taking action was asking myself if there are issues of justice that require me to stand up and be counted, even if it means confrontation with the powers that be and the accepted norms. I had to ask myself whether I wanted to be amongst the number who say, enough, no, things must change. Being moved to action is, for me, a sign of hope. I don't think injustice is difficult to identify, but having the strength to do something about it takes courage, especially when protesters are likely to be criminalised due to changes in the recent 2022 Policing and Crime Act. We need this hope. Passive acceptance feels like despair in light of all the powerful, moneyed, vested interests that purport to rule this world. The kingdom which Jesus heralded in speaks of God's different power and influence. One where the last shall be first, and the least the greatest. We need this hope. It's part of our Christian belief. St. Augustine of Hippo in the 2nd century said, "Hope has two beautiful daughters. Their names are anger and courage. Anger at the way things are, and courage to see that they do not remain as they are." One of the golden threads running throughout all of the Bible is the belief that God demands justice and the restoration of the downtrodden. 700 years before Jesus, the prophet Micah expressed this when he said, "What the Lord requires of his people is only to do justice, to love goodness, and walk humbly with your God." Wherever there is injustice, God needs people to speak out against it. It's not usually a popular message. In the last century, people like Martin Luther King Jr., campaigner for civil rights in the USA, German pastor and scholar Dietrich Bonhoeffer, stood up for justice, both of them losing their lives for doing so. Many of the objections to direct action highlight the inconvenience and disruption caused in the short term by protesters. I'm drawn to the old adage, often attributed, perhaps wrongly, to Archbishop Desmond Tutu, that in a crisis of pulling drowning people out of the river, the point must come where we go upstream to find why people are falling or being pushed in the river in the first place. Fuel poverty, climate crisis, racial or sexual discrimination. I'm sure protest is not for everyone, but I've concluded maybe it's time for a few more to go upriver and find out where some of our problems have their origins. Thanks for watching, praying, hoping.